In the exercises site, I've created a blank HTML page and I'm going to build a very simple form with just one input field and a submit button. I'll then explain how the form's input is processed. If you've used a previous version of Dreamweaver, there are some important differences in Dreamweaver CC. So to build a form, let's open the Insert panel and switch to the Form category. There are a lot of options inside this category, so I'm going to close the CSS Designer panel. And when I said a lot, I really did mean a lot. I won't be able to go through all of these options in the course, but the principles that apply to the most important ones are generally applicable to the others too. Incidentally, you can find all of these options on the Insert menu in the Form submenu. To insert a text input field, click Text, which is the second item at the top in Form. And you see that Dreamweaver immediately inserts the input field and a label with some placeholder text. You no longer get the Input Tag Accessibility Attributes dialog box that was displayed in older versions of Dreamweaver. The other change that might not be immediately obvious is that Dreamweaver doesn't remind you that you haven't put the field inside a form. That's because HTML5 doesn't require input fields to be nested inside the form element. However, older browsers still require all input elements to be inside a form, so that's the way I'll proceed. So let's undo that field. I'll press Ctrl Z on Windows, Command Z on a Mac, and insert a form. That's the first item at the top here. When you insert a form, Dreamweaver adds this red visual guide that indicates that there's a form in Design View. Of course, that red guide doesn't appear when you eventually publish your page. Let's have a look at the underlying HTML. So there is the form element. It's got an ID and a name. If you change the ID in the Property Inspector, it changes both the ID and the name. All input elements in a form have a name attribute, and it's the name attribute that is used by the processing script, and it's important that the name attribute should have no spaces in it. Let's look at the next form-related option in the Property Inspector. It's Action. This is the location of the server-side script that processes the form. HTML builds all the form elements, but it isn't capable of processing the data. Dreamweaver builds only the HTML for you. You need to provide the processing script yourself or get one from your hosting company. The next option is Method. By default, Dreamweaver sets this to Post. If we open that menu, the other main option is Get, and this is how the data is sent. I'll come back to this a little bit later. If you select Default, by the way, it removes the method from the opening HTML tag, but it uses the Get method, which is the default that is used by browsers. Most of the time you will use Post. At the bottom left of the Property Inspector are two checkboxes, No Validate and Autocomplete. These are new to HTML5, so are not supported by older browsers, but you can use them. They'll just be ignored by older browsers. No Validate, quite obviously, it does what it says. It prevents the form from being validated before it is submitted. Autocomplete, by default, forms do autocomplete, or at least HTML5 forms autocomplete. If you select this checkbox, it inserts autocomplete equals on, which is in fact the default. But if you deselect it after having selected it, it turns it to autocomplete equals off. So if you don't want your form to be autocompleted, first select that checkbox, then deselect it to set it to autocomplete equals off. Normally you don't need to deal with enctype or accept charset, so I'll ignore those. So let's add that input field, text. We need to change the default there to, let's put it name, and then select the input field. By default, the name is given text field. You need to change that. It needs to be a single word. So if you want to have first name, you'd have to have first name all as one word, or maybe with an underscore. And then I'm going to click at the end of that input field, press enter or return. That wraps it in a paragraph and creates a new paragraph. Putting form elements in paragraphs is a fairly good idea, and what I'm going to do then is to add a submit button. Now, in previous versions of Dreamweaver, everything was just called button. Now you've got different options for button, which you have to program yourself, submit button, which is the button that submits the form, and reset button, which is the button that clears everything in the form. I'm just going to use a submit button, so I'll click that, and the name is submit. It's a good idea to change that. I'm going to change it to send. Now these form action and form method options are new to HTML5, and basically they replicate what you've got up here in the opening form tag, so you don't need to set those. But to change this submit label here, what we can do is we change the value. So I'll just change that to send message. And when I press tab, you see that it changes it to send message, the label in the button, and it makes the button wider. So I'm going to save that page and then preview it in a browser. So let's bring the browser across. There it is. If I type my name in there and click send message, the form is submitted, but I'm not sending it anywhere, so everything just disappears. This is because I'm using the post method. Let's go back to Dreamweaver and select the form itself and change method from post to get. Then we'll save the page, go back to my browser, and I need to refresh the page. If I now type my name in there and submit, you see that at the end of the URL there's a question mark followed by first underscore name equals David and send, if we expand that a bit further, and send message. So what has happened is that when you use the get method, the values of all the form input fields, including the submit button, are sent through the URL. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, it's used mainly for search forms, because with it being part of the URL, you can then bookmark it. So you can use a search form to search for something and save the results page. But if what you're sending by the form has got anything confidential in it, you should send it by the post method. It's not completely secret, but it's not shown in the URL.